California's most expensive beach towns are finally losing their grip on renters, and the data behind the drop is a lot bigger than one city. For years, California beach towns felt like they could only do one thing: get more expensive. But in 2026, that story is changing fast, and some of the state's most desirable coastal markets are finally showing real signs of cooling. Take Santa Monica first, because it is one of the clearest examples of what is happening. The latest data shows the median rent there fell to $2,318 in February 2026, which is down 7.5% year over year and 2.34% month over month. That is a meaningful drop for one of the most famous and expensive beach cities in California. And Santa Monica is not some isolated case. Los Angeles rent prices have also slipped to a 4-year low, with the metro median around $2,167 in December 2025 and Los Angeles County at $2,035. When the biggest market in Southern California cools this much, the impact usually spreads to nearby coastal cities. That ripple is already showing up in places like Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, Laguna Beach, and Long Beach. Each city has its own market, its own pricing level, and its own renter demand. But together they tell the same story. The coastal rent boom is losing steam. Huntington Beach is still expensive, but it is no longer running hot the way it did during the pandemic surge. The average rent is around $2,476, and rents are slightly down over the past year. That may not sound dramatic, but in a market that used to feel like it could absorb constant increases, even a small decline tells you the balance has changed. That is what makes this trend so important. A market does not have to crash to be in trouble. Sometimes the real shift is slower and quieter. Growth cools first, then listings sit longer. Then landlords start offering concessions. Then the asking price begins to slide because the market is telling them the old number is too high. Newport Beach gives us a different version of that same story. This is still a luxury market, and there is no way around that. Depending on the source, average rent is listed anywhere from about $5,575 to $9,000. That widespread alone tells you how high-end and segmented the market is. But even there, recent reporting points to softer conditions than the frenzy we saw not too long ago. That matters because the more expensive the market, the more sensitive it becomes when demand starts to cool. When renters are paying premium prices, they expect premium value. If supply improves, or if the market simply loses momentum, the pressure shows up fast. Newport Beach is still one of the most desirable coastal markets in the state, but it is not immune to the broader slowdown. Laguna Beach is another important example. It remains one of the priciest rental markets in California, with one recent snapshot putting average rent around $7,995. But the year-over-year trend has softened, even if month-to-month pricing bounced a little. That tells us something important. Short-term movement can be noisy, but the bigger trend is what matters. In a market this expensive, even a modest annual decline is meaningful. It suggests renters are becoming more price-sensitive, and landlords may not have the same power to push rents higher without resistance. That is a big shift in a place where premium pricing once seemed almost untouchable. Long Beach fits into the same broader coastal slowdown, even though it is more of a transition market than a pure luxury beach town. It sits in the same Southern California coastal corridor, where renters now have more options and landlords face more competition than they did a few years ago. That makes Long Beach part of the larger story of coastal rent normalization. This is the part that people often miss. They hear that one beach city is down and assume the whole coast is collapsing. That is not really what is happening. What is happening is more gradual than that. The market is resetting. Some cities are seeing real declines. Others are flattening out. And others are still expensive but not rising nearly as fast as they were before. The biggest reason behind all of this is supply. Apartment List reported that the national multifamily vacancy rate reached 7.3% in March 2026, which is the highest level in its index history. At the same time, units were taking an average of 38 days to lease. That matters because when apartments sit longer, landlords lose pricing power. That is basic market math. If a unit leases quickly, the landlord can push higher rents. If it sits, the landlord starts to feel pressure. And if that happens across a market, the rent data starts to soften. That is exactly why some of California's most expensive beach towns are now showing lower rents or slower growth. Demand is part of the equation too. Higher borrowing costs have kept many would-be buyers in the rental market, but that does not automatically mean endless rent growth. In a market where new supply is arriving and renters are more selective, even expensive beach towns have to compete harder for tenants. And there has been a lot of new supply in some of these markets. In Los Angeles, more than 15,000 new apartment units were completed in 2025. That kind of volume can make a big difference when demand is not keeping up. Even in places that remain expensive, new construction gives renters alternatives, and those alternatives put pressure on pricing. Another thing worth watching is how quickly the beach premium is being tested. For a long time, people accepted the idea that living near the water automatically justified a much higher rent, even if the apartment itself was small, older, or missing major upgrades. But now renters are comparing value more closely, which means a place with a beach address is no longer enough on its own. If a unit is overpriced, outdated, or sitting in a building with lots of competition nearby, renters are simply willing to move on. That is why this story matters beyond just the rental market. It is another sign that California housing is shifting into a different phase. The old assumption was that coastal cities could keep getting more expensive forever, but the numbers are saying something else now. That does not mean these places are suddenly cheap. It does not mean Santa Monica, Newport Beach, or Laguna Beach are becoming affordable. They are not. But it does mean the market is no longer behaving like a one-way street. Renters have more leverage, landlords have more competition, and the days of automatic rent hikes are fading. One reason this shift feels so noticeable is because these beach cities have always carried a kind of pricing premium that went beyond the rent itself. People paid for the lifestyle, the location, the reputation, the walkability, the ocean access, and the idea that coastal California would always be in short supply. But when supply grows, when leasing slows, and when demand cools even a little, that premium starts to get challenged. You can see that psychology change in the way renters respond. Instead of jumping at the first available unit, they are taking more time. They are comparing neighborhoods. They are looking at parking, amenities, commute times, and deal terms. They are asking whether the beach town premium is worth it when another nearby city offers more space or a better price. That kind of behavior changes markets fast. A landlord in a high-demand, low-vacancy environment can be aggressive. But when a unit sits, when another similar listing is nearby, or when renters know they have choices, pricing power starts to evaporate. That is what makes the current slowdown so important. It is not just about a few lower rent numbers. It is about a change in the way the market works. It is also worth remembering that coastal California is not one uniform market. Santa Monica can cool while Newport Beach stays elevated. Huntington Beach can soften while Laguna Beach remains luxury-priced. Long Beach can act differently from both of them. But when all of these places start moving in the same general direction, it tells you the broader environment has changed. And that broader environment is still being shaped by interest rates, inflation pressure, construction activity, and renter behavior. Even people who are not buying homes are affected by those factors because they influence whether renters stay put, move out, renew, or negotiate harder. In other words, the rental market is not separate from the rest of housing. It is part of the same system. That is why the current coastal slowdown is worth paying attention to. It is not just a local story. It is a sign that the housing market is normalizing in places that were overheated for a long time. For years, the assumption was that the California coast could absorb endless demand. Now the numbers are suggesting that the coast is finally feeling the weight of its own price tags. For renters, that creates an opportunity. If you are looking in one of these coastal cities, now is the time to compare listings carefully. Watch how long units have been sitting and look for negotiating room. For landlords, it is a warning that aggressive pricing can backfire when tenants have more choices and fewer reasons to rush. And for everyone else watching the California housing market, this is the real headline. Even the most desirable beach towns in the state are no longer immune to rent slowdowns. The coastal boom is fading, and the data is finally showing it. Subscribe to Housing IQ for more real estate news and housing market data that keeps you in the know.